This might sound odd, to say the least, but there was a season of my life where I could see how much I was growing and maturing as a person, as a follower of Jesus, based on how comfortable I was dancing. To kind of explain it probably helps to tell a little bit of a story that begins on the first day of 7th grade, when to my horror, my 7th grade communications teacher announced to the class that on the Friday before the first middle school dance, he was going to take the class period to teach us how to slow dance. And so I was afraid and, maybe a little excited about it, but mostly afraid. And then the day came and he taught us, the classic middle school, like swaying, slow dance. And after it, I was very grateful because I used those skills for years. Not often, but for years nonetheless. And middle school dances and high school dances, wedding here or there, the few occasions that I had the courage and got lucky enough to ask a girl and she said yes, I used that skill. But I wouldn't dance in hardly any other way because I was afraid that I would look like a fool. Right? This fear inhibited me from dancing in any other way. To be really honest with you, the only time that I danced in any other fashion at that time and season was when I was in high school and I had a season of life where I drank alcohol, which of course I don't recommend or encourage, but that was a season of my life. And I did it for the same reason many do it, which is when I did that, I felt the grip of fear on my life lessen. And so it was interesting, as I realized later, particularly in college, as I grew in my faith, one reality or outcome of my growing in faith was that my life became less dictated by my fears. And in particular, this included my fear of looking like a fool when dancing. And this came up in a few different occasions. Some of these actually conferences I went to, Christian conferences I went to in college, would have like a night of dancing. And so if you can picture it, I went to Mines with a bunch of engineering guys, and we would dance. And that helped too, because nobody was that good. And it was definitely a process, a progress. I still remember, I have a distinct memory where one time a friend of mine's like yelling over the music as you would at these things, and he's like, "John, move your feet, man." And apparently I was like learned to dance where I would like dance but not lift up my feet, which is pretty ridiculous, but that's just what it was. Now, of course, at this point, at least some of you or maybe all of you are going, what does this have to do with anything? And I just want us to get to thinking about how much fear paralyzes us. And this is really important because one aspect of the offer of Christianity to all of us, whether we've been people who believe for a long time, whether we're people not sure what we believe, is this promise that the love of God drives out all fear. And when nobody likes the feeling of being dictated and controlled by our fears. And so this is a great promise. And if we live lives that are unafraid, that means we will do things that are uninhibited by our fear and shame. And this is something that we see in our text as we see this woman do something uninhibited by fear and shame, and something done because of her great love. And so my hope this morning is that we would experience and see God's great love today in such a way that we would experience a little bit more of that freedom from fear. So to do this, we're simply going to look at this text, and it's a text that's about religious insiders and outsiders. And we're just going to look at them kind of objectively and then ask the question simply, what do we learn from the religious insiders and outsiders? So let's look at our text. It's from Mark 14, verses 1 through 11. Hear these words from the book that we love. Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away. And the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. So this text is a classic, what they call a Markan sandwich. So you may have noticed this throughout Mark's gospel, as he tells many stories in this sandwich format, where he has a central story sandwiched by two slices of bread that are a related story to what the central idea. Now, what's kind of confusing about our story is, as I said, this is about religious outsiders and insiders. And what's confusing is the outside of the sandwich is about religious insiders, and the inside of the sandwich is about religious outsiders. So let's try to walk through this carefully. So the outside of the bread is about religious insiders. And the first slice is about the chief priests and the teachers of the law, where we read that they want to kill Jesus. But they don't want to do it during the festival because the people will riot, there'll be rebellion. And this has been building, right? If you've been reading Mark's gospel, we see this. Going back to Mark 11:18, we read, "The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him," Jesus, "for they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching." They didn't like Jesus because he was teaching in a way that made them look like less teachers. People stopped showing up to hear them teach, stopped asking them questions. Instead, they began following and going to Jesus more and more. Then this anger intensifies. In Mark 12:12 we read, "Then the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders looked for a way to arrest him because they knew he had spoken the parable against them. But they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away." So I won't get into the details of the parable, but essentially Jesus is exposing them. He's saying, he's being pretty clear. He's still teaching in a parable, but he's being clear enough that anybody who's paying attention would notice that Jesus is speaking against them. He's exposing the frauds that they are, and they, of course, don't like this, and they want to kill him. Now, one of the things I want to highlight is that we see that they respond to this, and they kind of know that they're doing something wrong because they respond to it by doing things in secret and quiet. They know that they can't be transparent about what they're doing because what they're doing is shady. And we'll come back to this later. But let's move to the back end of the sandwich. So the front end of the sandwich, chief priests, teachers of the law, religious insiders in one way. The back end of the sandwich is Judas. Also, of course, a religious insider. Somebody, not just a religious insider, a Jesus insider. I mean, Mark says, every time he talks about Judas, he says Judas, one of the 12, one of those 12 who were close with Jesus. And yet, as we read, he is the one that's going to betray Jesus, going to hand him over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. So keep that in mind as we then turn and look at the religious outsiders. And the outsiders are outsiders in multiple ways. First, they're physically outside. Notice that Jesus is in Bethany. He's not in Jerusalem. He's visiting Jerusalem. He's there for the festival, but he doesn't stay on the inside. He goes to the outside. Second, we see he stays at an outsider's house. He goes to Simon the leper's house. This is probably somebody who had leprosy, doesn't currently have leprosy. Because otherwise nobody would come to his house, even if Jesus was there. But it's somebody who was healed, but somebody who carries it with him. More than likely, he probably had scars on his hands and fingers from this skin disease. And this detail is something that Mark and other gospel writers include that speaks to their eyewitness account. So the way this works in a lot of gospel writings is when Mark includes the detail of this, of not just Simon, but Simon the leper at Bethany, it's so that somebody who reads that goes, oh, Simon the leper at Bethany, I know him, and if this happened, I should go ask him. So Mark includes this in his gospel, as do many others. And then the third aspect of the outsider is, of course, the unnamed woman who pours out the perfume. And it's almost ironic or just surprising that Mark leaves her unnamed. Because Jesus says here, as he says in the other Gospels, that wherever the gospel is preached, what she has done will be told. And yet, she's left without a name. So these are the outsiders. So what can we learn from these two groups? Well, let's look first at the religious insiders, because frankly, most of us are religious insiders. And what we first receive from them is a strong warning. And this, again, because we are religious insiders. I, of course, am. I'm paid clergy. There's nothing almost as insider as me. But, some of you would give me a run for my money, right? Some of you have attended church long before I was ever born. And so it'd be close on who was more of a religious insider, you or me. We are insiders. And the warning is important because what we see in this text, what we see in many areas in Scripture, what we see if we look in the world around us, is the greatest threat to God's people is from within. It's not external threats. It's not what's happening in the world around us. It's what happens within these walls. It's what happens among us as a community. Even if we went back and looked at God's covenant with the people of Israel, he has some words about external things, but mainly he says, remain faithful to me. Take care of one another as an act of your faithfulness to me, and I will take care of all the external nations. And I bring this up because on one hand, it's easy to forget. And also I bring it up because right now we live in a time where many people say the opposite. They say that the church is under attack, that the church is being, especially here in America, that we're being persecuted, that we have all these outside cultural forces that are the real danger in our lives. And people use it particularly as political fire. And that's just missing the point that the greatest threat to God's people is from within. This was actually driven home to me a couple weeks ago when I was at a classis meeting. For those of you unfamiliar with how our denomination and structure works, we're part of a denomination that gathers with other churches around us, and we call that gathering a classis, which is like a Dutch term for a fleet of ships. I don't know why, but that's what it is. Anyways, we gather twice a year to provide support and accountability. And a part of the classis, there is what we call a safe church team. And like many teams and committees in church world, it always needs new members. And an elder shared that he had just joined the church last time, or just joined this safe church committee last time. And the reason he joined it was he goes, well, I used to serve in the military in the Middle East during the 80s and 90s, and maybe my expertise from there can help the church, help keep the church safe from these external threats, these external dangers. So he joined it, and he took the training, and in the training he discovered Safe Church is not about external threats, because that's not our biggest threat. Safe Church is about abuse that has happened and does happen in churches throughout our country, throughout our world, and the steps that we should be taking to prevent and bring justice to those situations when they do happen. He had this great line where he just realized, he's like, the greatest threat is not out there, but it's in our own walls. And that's true not just with areas of abuse, but with our whole life together. So what does this actually look like? Well, let's look at the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and Judas. One thing we can pay attention to are what are the things we do to cling to status and power, or to increase our status and power. Right? The chief priests and the teachers of the law, they're upset at Jesus because their fame, their power, they are losing it to him. Judas, it's unclear in Mark. Mark doesn't really say, but in other texts we see that he gets motivated by money that he's been taking from the purse. So when this woman pours out perfume, he's upset because it's less money that he can take. And so a question for us is, what do we cling to? And a way to help us think about what we cling to is to pay attention to what we do in secret. Because we notice that what the chief priests and the teachers of the law, based on what they're losing or based on what they're trying to gain, they go about it in secret. That they plot to kill Jesus in secret, that Judas goes quietly to the chief priests to betray him. And so for you and I, a great question to regularly ask ourselves is, what am I doing in secret? What are the conversations that I may be having with some people that I wouldn't want others to hear? Because often that's a sign of stuff within us that we're clinging to, that are disruptive and can be damaging to our community. Now, second, and perhaps just as important, is we can learn from these religious insiders is to know that our failures do not ruin the mission of Jesus. As we near Jesus' crucifixion, one of the challenges that we have is to properly view Judas' betrayal. Because on one hand, of course, it's wrong. Of course, it's sinful. Of course, it's something that astonishes us. But at the same time, it doesn't ruin the mission. It doesn't ruin what Jesus is doing. Jesus is able to use it as a crucial step in his work. And this is true of all failures. Our failures, the failures of the church at large, is it's not the end. The world isn't over because we screwed up, because they screwed up. God, his mercy and grace and power is greater than any mistake you or I or we corporately could ever make. And this means we can always find forgiveness and mercy when we turn to God. And this is a lesson we know as we keep reading the story that Judas sadly never learns. But Peter does. I don't know about you, but for me, I always find it really beneficial to keep Peter and Judas next to each other, because in many ways they do the same thing. They betrayed Jesus in very powerful and profound ways. The only difference is that Peter holds out some glimmer of hope, some glimmer of hope for forgiveness, where Judas is overcome by his guilt and he takes his own life. And so we can learn from the insiders that our failures are not the end. Our failures are just an opportunity to receive the mercy of God once again. So that's what we can learn from insiders. What can we learn from the outsiders? Well, we can learn that when we grasp that Jesus forgives, heals, and restores, that our response is adoration and love. And we see this first in Simon the leper. Again, Simon is known for his past disease. Again, he literally bears on his body the marks of this leprosy. And yet Jesus chooses to go to his house. He comes to him, and it's maybe intentional that the one person who really knew what it's like to be unwelcome, to be unaccepted into anyone's house, the leper, he's the one that Jesus gives the opportunity to extend hospitality to others. Because perhaps he's the one who really knows what it's like to be on the outside looking in. So I want you to know that for you, as you look at your life, as you consider the marks that you bear in your life, maybe physical marks, maybe emotional marks, spiritual marks, that whatever you've endured, whether things that have been done to you, maybe foolish things that you have done, they, of course, are nothing that would keep Jesus from coming to you. In fact, Jesus will come to you and may, on those very places of pain and suffering, bring healing and invite you from that place of pain, from that mark of suffering, to use it as a gift for his work. Because this is what we see in Simon. He exercises the gift of hospitality as being one who knew what it was like to be left on the outside. So this is what we can learn from the outsiders, is that Jesus can overcome our scars for good. And so if we know that Jesus is greater than our failures, if he can overcome all of our scars, then the response is a life of uninhibited love, a life free of fear. We can be the woman who pours out the perfume that offers to Jesus all that we have, all that we are. Jesus overcomes our scars and failures and frees us to adore him. And what this looks like is that some of our devotion to Jesus will be unscripted. We'll notice in this whole interaction just how upset many get at this woman because she's wasting the perfume, that the money could have been used for the poor. And Jesus makes the statement. He goes, "You'll have the poor with you." But she did the right thing. Just as a little thing, sometimes people twist this line that Jesus is kind of downplaying the care for the poor. What Jesus is actually doing is he's quoting Deuteronomy 15:11, where he says, "There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land." He's quoting that. He's saying that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But all he's adding is, but what she did right now in this moment was good, because it was what he needed. His body needed to be prepared for burial. She understood that. And this points to this obvious and yet easily forgotten aspect, which is that our relationship to Jesus, this devotion to Jesus, should be more than what we do on schedule, should be more than what we do on routine, just like all of our relationships. Any marriage, any relationship, it's easy for it to just be the routine. That it's like, hey, this is what we do on Monday, this is what we do on Tuesday, this is what we do in the fall, this is what we do in the spring. But healthy relationships, we know they have these unscripted moments. And this is true of our relationship with Jesus. Discipline is of course good. Daily prayers, daily scripture readings, regularly gathering in corporate worship is great. But a sign of a healthy relationship is these moments of spontaneity, is these times where we're moved to an act of devotion that's out of the routine. And this can show up in many different ways. Maybe it's simply the humming or singing of tunes that move you in a moment. Maybe it's praying at a different time or in a different way than you normally do. Maybe it's being caught up in expressing gratitude to God in a way that's out of your norm. Maybe it's in a profound act of generosity. Instead of just saying, this is what we budgeted, this is what we're going to give to these things, to these situations, you're moved. Particularly as you see the face of those discarded, those marginalized, and you see in them the face of Jesus, you're moved as an act of adoration and devotion to him. If we know that Jesus overcomes our scars and failures, that's the only way we're actually free to love. To me, the pinnacle of what this looks like is David's dancing when he brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Many of you might remember this story. David, in one of his earliest acts as king, he gets the Ark of the Covenant, he brings it to Jerusalem, and we read this. He's pretty excited, to say the least, about this happening. He says, wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord, not just a little bit, not just some, but with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and sounds of trumpets. And if you keep reading, we read that his wife, who's the daughter of Saul, the first king of Israel, she's embarrassed. She says this isn't how a king is supposed to act. And when David gets home, she tells him, this isn't what you're supposed to do. And David gives this response. He says, what I've done, it was before the Lord, who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. David is so enraptured with what God has done for him that he doesn't care how foolish he looks to his wife, He doesn't care if he looks foolish even to himself. He doesn't care, of course, if he looks foolish to others. He only cares about expressing his adoration to the one who chose him, the one who has done so much good to him, the one that has moved his heart that he might be free of fear and express his deep love. And that's the offer to each of us. Let me pray for us.